Well, good evening or good morning, whichever is applicable to you, and welcome to our VLGA and LGIU Global Executive Live Panel, our last session for 2025, would you believe? We'll be discussing one of the most important issues affecting communities today, housing and homelessness, and how local councils can play a role in addressing this challenge. My name is Chris Eddy, and I'll be your host this evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. We'll get an understanding of this shared challenge over the next hour or two and look at some of the different approaches being developed by councils in different parts of the world and the importance of good working relationships across all levels of government. I'll introduce you to our panel very shortly. But first, if I could, on behalf of the VLGA, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. Now, can I introduce Jonathan Carr-West, who is the CEO of LGIU, to welcome you on behalf of his organisation. Hello, Jonathan. And you need to come off mute, Jonathan.
Of course I do. As you know, Chris, I like to do that to make everyone else feel better when they do it later.
Job done.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, good evening. Really great to be here again with you for another one of these executive live panels with VLGA. We've been doing these for 5 years together now, so they're really well established, and that for our perspective, they're a really great part of our Future Local Lab, where we bring local government professionals from across the globe together. I'm delighted to see that we've got LGIU members and colleagues from the UK, from Ireland, from Australia here with us. So welcome and thank you to all of you for being here. Just a very lightning introduction to LGIU for those of you who aren't members. We are a membership organisation for local government. We've been supporting councils around the world for 43 years now. And we have more than 300 councils across the UK, Ireland and Australia in part of our network. And we do these events because one of our core beliefs at LGIU is that we need to learn from each other. We need to know what councils in other countries are doing, how they're tackling key issues for their communities. Because, and this is another one of our core values, we think that without doubt, the most innovative and effective answers to global challenges come from local government. But we also know that finding the time to share, to learn, to connect isn't easy. So that's why we do these panels. Our Future Local Lab is all about those insights, those connections, resources that help local government around the world prepare for these emerging challenges. Because we think that whatever these, when you look at the big global trends, whether it's climate, whether it's demographics, whether it's economics, the impacts of those come home to roost in local communities, and they're dealt with by local government. So we want to find solutions. We all want to find solutions to many of the same issues. And so there's a real value in sharing around that. What we're talking about today, housing, homelessness, we know is a key issue for councils everywhere in our network, and one that remains kind of persistent and has a real insidious impact on communities. So it's a crucial issue that we want to change. So that's what today's all about. Very grateful to you all for being here, and I'll hand back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good to have you here as always. And now for the other half of this important partnership, the CEO of the VLGA, Catherine Arndt. Good evening, Catherine.
Good evening, Chris, and good morning to those of us, or those who are joining us from overseas. As Jonathan mentioned, we've been facilitating these global live panels now for over 5 years. We were delighted to be able to partner with LGIU, which is, as Jonathan said, a very similar organisation to the VLGA, but based over in the UK. But together we have a global network of councils and councillors who come together to join us at panels such as we're hosting tonight to talk about the really important issues that are facing our sector globally. So not only locally, not only nationally, but across the globe, we know that local government has an important role to play in tackling homelessness. As the level of government closest to the people and communities, councils are often the most impacted by housing stress and homelessness, and they bring unique insights that help shape place-based solutions. We all know that when councils are actively involved, solutions can be advanced more quickly and effectively, yet too often their knowledge of local needs is overlooked by those who control the funding. We know that housing affordability, economic hardship, and changing family circumstances are among the key drivers of homelessness. This is an issue that is increasing, unfortunately, and it demands a response from all levels of government. It is complex, requiring compassion, collaboration, and leadership. Local government contributes through advocacy, partnerships, and prevention programs, but the pressures are significant, particularly for regional and rural councils that are already stretched for resources. That's why any measures to increase housing supply must ensure local government is at the table at every level of engagement. And without that voice, we risk missing the solutions that the communities themselves know will work best. I'm really looking forward to hearing insights from our panellists this evening, and I encourage all of you to contribute your thoughts and experiences from your own municipalities throughout the discussion. Please feel free to add any questions in the Q&A box below, and we'll endeavour to get through them throughout the course of the presentation. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our very best. But that's enough from me now, and I'll hand back over to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And as Catherine mentioned, the Q&A box is there for your questions, but also there is the chat box, and I see some of you already starting to use that. It's always a nice idea if you could introduce yourself and let everyone know where you are joining us from on the session today. That's open throughout the course of the panel. This session is being recorded. We've had, I think, close to a record number of registrations, and we do find a lot of people register because they know they can access this recording and watch it at their leisure at a later date. So that will be made available to all those who've registered in the coming days. Okay, let's get started with this important discussion. I want to very briefly tell you who is part of our panel tonight. We'll hear in a moment from Andrew Lee, who is the Director of Housing at Liverpool City Council, one of the UK's core cities, leading homelessness and housing services within the city. I'll tell you a little more about Andrew in just a moment. Also joining us will be Derek McGowan, the Service Director for Housing and Homelessness at the City of Edinburgh in Scotland, of course. Fiona Cornelia is joining us. Fiona is the Executive Director of Q Shelter and has held that role since 2018. We'll find out a bit more about Fiona and Q Shelter later in the session. And our final speaker will be Dr. Michael Fotheringham, who is the Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Some terrific speakers to have as part of our panel this evening, and I'm sure you'll gain a lot from the conversation. So let's start with our first speaker, and I want to introduce and tell you a little more about Andrew Lee, who, as I mentioned, is with Liverpool City Council, but has been working in the housing sector for over 30 years, working for registered providers and major local authorities in the Midlands and northwest of England. He has a broad experience of housing, from delivering frontline services through to strategic housing, business planning and housing governance. In his previous role at Salford City Council, he led the establishment of a number of housing companies, including a registered provider to own and manage affordable homes built by the City Council. So Andrew is going to speak to us for a few minutes. We have some slides, as you can see. So Andrew Lee, good evening, welcome, or good morning to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, good evening to everyone on the seminar. As Chris said, Director of Housing at Liverpool City Council. I've got a couple of slides. I just wanted to run through the context within which we're operating within Liverpool, and then go on to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. So very, very briefly, I think it's fair to say there's been a significant increase in the private rented sector within the city over the last 10, 20 years. It's now larger than the social rented sector. Rents have been increasing over quite well above inflation over the last couple of years. I think it's fair to say that Liverpool is quite a poor city. It's the third most deprived local authority in England, and earnings are below the English average. We also have the impact of national policy, like the freezing of the local housing allowance, and that contributes as well with the cost of living crisis. So next slide, please, Belinda. And just a little bit more about the economy. Fair to say that it also is the fourth most visited city in the United Kingdom. Football tourism being a big driver of that, and there's been a big rise in Airbnbs as well within the city, which I think impacts on the wider housing market. Next slide, please, Belinda. So a little bit about homeless trends within the city. So these are extracts taken from our databases around homelessness. But what we've seen in since the pandemic has been a significant increase in homelessness, a significant increase in the numbers in temporary accommodation. So we currently have 1,700 households in temporary accommodation in the city. The cost of temporary accommodation is around £700,000 per week. We have around 500 to 550 applications per month. Not all of those clearly will have a successful homelessness application. Again, on the other side, you'll see that the rising numbers in terms of TA and those costs. And we have a significant rough sleeper issue within the city, and our average around about 30 rough sleepers on the streets each night. So that's really it's quite shocking figure. Next slide, please. So what we've been doing in Liverpool, we have got a significant transformation programme, and it's linked to our homeless and rough sleeper strategy, which is about making homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring in Liverpool. And I'm not going to go through all the work streams. I'm not going to go through all the detail. I could probably do a whole presentation on that. But I'm just going to give you some key highlights from that. So one of the key things for us is about increasing the number of homelessness preventions. We are not very good at that at the moment. We respond too late, and we respond when it's got to a crisis. So only about 10 to 20% of our presentations we're able to prevent, and we very much the focus of our part of our transformation programme is investing in our service. So currently we have 30 members of staff within our homelessness team, and we're increasing that to 90. So a significant amount of that is investment in prevention. And we see that as an investor save. We believe that we can save money by preventing homelessness, and we can get down our temporary accommodation bill, which is around £30 million a year. Also, we're looking to source better value and better quality temporary accommodation. A lot of the temporary accommodation that we source is a nightly rate. We're going to move away from that. But we've been doing a lot of work around getting our nightly rates down since the start of the year, and we've decreased those by around about 15%. So actually what we're paying, we've still got increasing numbers in TA, but we're actually managing to stabilise our costs through a reduction in nightly rates. We want to move households out of temporary accommodation. It's not sustainable. It's not fit for purpose. The outcomes for residents, the households is poor. So we're doing a lot of work around how we can move people through temporary accommodation quicker, use of the private rented sector, direct matching with working with our registered provider partners as well. And then we need to communicate better with households. We need to have more constant contact with them. We've now got a single front door. We have regular contact with our customers as well, and there's that timely interventions. And finally, better data collection. When I came into post a year ago, we really didn't know what was going on. So we worked with Cabinet Office, UK Government Cabinet Office as part of their test and learn, and they've supported us in setting up some measures and mechanisms to measure homelessness and to measure our spend, which is starting to really drive some of the improvements and where we need to focus our efforts. Next slide, please, Belinda. So we also have launched our homelessness and rough sleeper strategy. It was approved by Cabinet in July of this year. It's about to be launched with stakeholders next week. This has been a significant piece of work that we've done. We've worked very closely with our stakeholders, be that voluntary, statutory, people with lived experience, to develop a strategy that people can buy into and can understand and support. On the right of the slide, we have a ladder out of homelessness, And of those 8 rungs, they form the 8 ambitions within our housing, within our homelessness and rough sleeping strategy. Next slide, please. And finally, I just wanted to say a little bit about governance, and that's to say we very much believe that the homelessness is everyone's business. We recognise that the local authority has statutory responsibilities, but actually we really need to work together to solve homelessness. And I think it's fair to say there is a strong partnerships spirit within the city on which we can draw. I can talk a little bit more about how I think we've had to re-engage with a lot of our voluntary sector organisations. A lot of promises have been made to them perhaps in the past and we haven't delivered on that. There has been an element of rebuilding trust with them. But the partnership board that we've set up has the oversight of the strategy, and the responsibility for its delivery sits within that partnership board. So again, a wide range of participants on that board to help drive the implementation of the strategy, but also that principle that it is everybody's business. And thank you. That's my short presentation, but happy to take any questions or have a further conversation.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I do have a couple, and I notice someone in the audience is wondering what the population there of Liverpool City Council is. What is that number?
Around 500,000.
Right. So you mentioned some numbers. You mentioned the £30 million a year for temporary accommodation, which is a big bill in anyone's book. And I know you've had some financial pressures there, haven't you? And some government intervention going back a little while,
we did.
predating you and your role. How has that led into the trust issue that you also talked about? What sort of a challenge is that for you?
So we had statutory intervention, as I said. I mean, it was never around financial pressure. It was not around housing. It was more around governance and property issues. But the commissioners were very interested in homelessness, and then particularly were interested in the pressures that it was having on the city council, because ultimately it's one of the four frightful, or the frightful four, as they call it, along with adults, children's and SEND, and so clearly it will have a big impact for the council. I think on the trust issue, again, I wasn't here, but I think one of the issues was that people weren't really listened to, they weren't really engaged, when the promises were made around, oh yes, we're going to sort this out, we're going to sort that out. And I think one of the things that we've had to bring to the discussion is a realism about this is going to take time to resolve, time to sort out. And those regular meetings, we talked about the partnership board, we always have a forum where we have all our partners. I think what they've been, they felt very distrustful of the local authority. We've made promises, if we said we're going to do this, it's going to do that, and it wouldn't do it. Partly that was capacity issues, I think it's fair to say. But there was also a little bit of a revolving door before I started, in terms of a number of interims coming in and going, and again there wasn't that sort of continuity. So again, I think what we've done as part of the transformation and the part of the building the team is putting in key posts, pointing to those posts directly. People can start to establish those relationships and start to build that trust with stakeholders. And I feel that the forum now, our housing forum, which again has a wide range of people, including people with lived experience, that they're really starting to feel as though we're listening, we're responding, we're not just coming along and saying we're going to do this and then 6 months later we've done nothing. They can see the work that's going on around improving the service.
Andrew, lots of questions coming in, and we will come back to most of these a little later in our Q&A session. But there's one I did want to hone in on, and Andrew has picked up on this homelessness partnership board that you talked about. Can you just briefly talk about how that works in practice?
Yeah, so it meets quarterly. It's chaired by one of the charities, but it has a range of agencies, both statutory agencies, the local authority, voluntary agencies, people with lived experience, and we've given it the responsibility, sort of oversight and delivery of the strategy. Now, we see the role very much as if there's challenges, if there's blockages, if partners or individuals are struggling to deliver that, how can that partnership, how can they uncover some of those or help to address some of those issues? What are those blockages? Could someone help with those blockages? So it's very much in a sort of a collaborative approach. Again, it gives other stakeholders an opportunity to speak to both local authority officers as well, but also other agencies, be they from, DWP attend that, health colleagues attend that, Integrated Care Board colleagues attend it. So there's a whole range of our colleagues attending that. But I think it gives people an opportunity. It meets quarterly. It's minuted. So things don't get lost. I think that's one of the benefits of it.
Terrific. Thank you, Andrew. We'll come back to you a little later in the session, but thank you for setting the scene there from Liverpool. Let's move on to Edinburgh and bring in Derek McGowan, who's the Service Director for Housing and Homelessness in Edinburgh. Derek started out his career at Edinburgh before he left in 2016 to take up the post of Head of Communities and Housing at Aberdeen City Council. Later was appointed the Head of Early Intervention and Community Empowerment, responsible for housing and homelessness, equality, community safety, community learning and libraries, as well as developing early intervention and prevention practice for the council. And he returned to Edinburgh in March of 2023. A rich history there around this space of housing and homelessness. Derek, good morning to you. Welcome to our session. Please take a few minutes to tell us how it all looks in Edinburgh.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Good morning and good evening over in Australia. It's great to be here. So yeah, I've got a few slides on here. There's a lot of information, so that's partly just to share. I won't be going through everything that's on the screen, but if we could move on to the first slide. This is a bit of a catch-all, round about just over 500,000 people, but you'll see that the population in Edinburgh is increasing quite significantly. It's going up, and we're projecting a further increase of about 7% compared to 2% for Scotland as a whole. But a capital city, we expect there's an economy aspect there, people coming to the capital city looking to live, looking to work. But as you can see on the left, there'll be over 50,000 new homes needed over that timescale as well in order to house everyone that's coming. That'll be affordable accommodation as well as private owned as well. We are the 5th largest landlord in Scotland with about 21,000 council homes, but lower than the Scottish average rent, social rent rather. And as I think as the previous speaker alluded to, quite a high number of private rented sector in the city as well. So Scottish average at 13%. And we're at 23%. So we know we've got some market issues in Edinburgh, we've got some economic issues, and they're probably played out in some key statistics. Our average rental for a 3-bedroom house is well above the national average, about 27% it says there, but to buy a 3-bedroom house in Edinburgh is about 97% above the national average, so certainly affordability. We have 5,500 to 6,000 households currently in temporary accommodation. So it's households, you'll see at the top there, 12,000 people-ish, and about 3,000 of them are children and young people. And we're averaging about 350 presentations a month looking for property. So big, again, issue there. And then right in the middle of the screen, you'll see one of the main problems we have, 333 bids per property for a social home. Some new ones we've had in the last year have attracted over 1,000 bids simply for one house. So we can see the clamour for affordable housing there. And as Andrew said earlier, a big link into poverty. And we reckon about 1 in 5 children in our city are living in poverty. As you'll see at the top of the screen, many of them are in temporary accommodation. If we could move on, please. So we have some serious issues around trying to comply with legislation. So the legislation in Scotland is different from that in England and Wales, and we have specific legislation around the suitability of accommodation. So that's to do with shared facilities, it's to do with the size of the properties, etc. And due to the pressures we have and the numbers of homelessness households that we have, at the moment, we have some real issues with complying with key legislation. So we have around probably about 50 to 60 rough sleepers every night. We have, as I said, there are about 350 presentations every month, but around about half of those presentations, we can't provide any housing for them. And sometimes those people are presenting every day, sometimes twice a day, to see if anything's happened. So there's a strain on service provision. But you'll see there, I think in June, we were at almost 2/3 of all presentations we were unable to provide accommodation for. And for all those households that we have, around 1,000 of those are in legally unsuitable accommodation. Around what's really important for us is those children and young people. So we are getting judicial review threats that are costly, and combined with low stock turnover. That means that we have an acute problem in providing accommodation, full stop, an acute problem in providing suitable accommodation. And some of the average wait times we have, for example, can be up to 2 years for getting accommodation that's suitable for you to stay in. And we are contracting and commissioning with many private sector landlords through a private sector leasing scheme to try and provide that accommodation and try and add to what we can provide to satisfy our legal duty. If we could move on, please. As probably a lot of you will understand, homelessness doesn't come alone, and this is just an example of some illustration rather of the support needs that we have. About half of the people we have in for temporary accommodation for homelessness support have no support needs, they just need the house. But you'll see there mental health, disabilities, alcohol, drug dependence, etc. loom large in the work that has to be done, and that means we work extensively with third sector providers, local charities, national charities, but our children and families teams, our education teams, our social work teams, to try and manage all those issues and try and resolve the issues that they face, so that when they do get accommodation, people are more likely to be able to live in that and make a success of it, to sustain the tenancy longer. If we could move on, please. So that's a bit of context, a bit of background for us, and this is really about our declaration of a housing emergency, the slide that's on the screen. So in Scotland now, 13 local authorities, there are 32 here, 13 have declared housing emergencies. We were the second to do so, the first city to do so, and it's really driven by those key statistics that I set out in the last couple of slides there, that high demand, the compliance standards that we have. The legislation, I would say, in Scotland is probably, I would say, sector leading in terms of the rights it affords people, the rights it affords households to access accommodation. In the recent years, issues such as having to show a local connection to an area have been removed. There's no priority on specific people-specific characteristics in order to get housing as well. So it's maybe a bit more level. Priority need, for example, doesn't exist anymore, but we've declared a housing emergency. The Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament have also declared a housing emergency. So housing and homelessness specifically is very, very high profile in Scotland, and certainly in Edinburgh, it's probably the highest risk we have on our council dashboard in terms of the risks we face each day. If we could move on, please. And this is just a quick illustration of the main themes in our housing emergency action plan. So we were the first authority, the first city authority to declare a housing emergency. We were the first authority in Scotland to identify what we were going to do about that and set it out strategically. And that's recently been refined, and you can see here clearly, simply there are housing supply issues and there are housing demand issues. There are lots of actions underneath there, as you would all expect. There are work streams and projects, etc. But we're looking to increase and improve supply as fast as we can, as hard as we can. Be responsive to the housing market. That's about planning. That's about how we can get houses built, we can get shovels in the ground, and look at new delivery models of housing in the city. So what's different? Modular build, for example, where are we building gap sites, etc. All the small sites that they can maybe fill in. But then the demand for housing, and that's really where we are really putting effort in and focus in, is around homelessness prevention. How do we do that? Who do we need to work with? What does the data tell us around making those plans, putting them in place and delivering them? And that's something I think we'll see in a later slide, we're actually being really successful on. If we could move on, please. And this is just something about supply, just to show the problems we have. Approvals of new construction, new housing in the city are the blue columns, and completions are in orange, and you'll see the approvals are going down. So while the population is increasing, the approvals for new housing are decreasing, and the completion rates are variable. So it just kind of tends to show the difficulties we have in adding the housing that people need. Yeah, again, if we could move on, please. And construction cost increases. So we are largely funded by the Scottish Government in terms of house building. We have an affordable housing supply programme in Scotland that nationally is about £770 million a year, divided by 32 authorities. For us, that means about 45 million. You'll see only 5 years ago, building a house was £157,000, and it's considerably, almost, £250,000 now. So it's gone up about £100,000 in 5 years. To put that into context, and over the same time period, our bill for homelessness services in 2019-20 was 28 million, and this year it's going to be 80 million. So it's gone through the roof. It's considerable, and you see the costs here. When the cost goes up and the grant stays the same, you can simply build less houses, and that's a problem we're having. Could we move on again, please? And so this is where I'd like to just spend a wee bit more time, and I'm sure there'll be some questions on this. This is around our homelessness prevention activity. The green line at the top is a cumulative prevention that we have put in place overall, and you'll see we're going on 4,500 cases prevented in the last 18 months or so. This is joint work. It's work with partners, it's work with NHS, it's work with any sector that we can get involved in order to do it. We have specific services set up. We've got a family and household support service that works intensively with people to make sure that they can stay in their houses where they can, where they're threatened with homelessness, where we can sustain them where they are, where we can find them new housing, probably in the private rented sector, to stop an eviction happening, or work with the landlord in order to do that. It's also about employability. It's about benefits access, about making sure we can get as much money into that household as well. But it's also sometimes around education. It's working with education to resolve concerns that are there, making sure that housing is available in the right parts of the city. Housing First programmes, which many of you will use, have been a good help in terms of working like this as well. We also have a couple of key bodies. We have a homelessness task force, which is a subcommittee of the council. It's chaired by our council's housing, homelessness and fair work convener, which shows the political interest here, and that brings the council together with third sector providers to talk about strategy and talk about issues. And under our community planning partnership, which is a statutory body, and this is a big piece of work I wanted to achieve, and we've got there around making sure that homelessness is a city issue, not a council issue. And through the community planning partnership, by setting up the strategic housing group, we've managed to get benefit agencies involved. We've got housing providers around the room, around the table, ourselves, police, NHS. So actually looking at the broad spectrum of homelessness issues, about money, about income, about employability, about maybe justice issues that are being faced there, but also about how we get the housing, how we get people into it and do that. So lots of success there in doing it. You'll see the numbers there speak volumes. That has probably prevented costs. It's not saved money, it's prevented costs of probably about £100 million over that timescale that we can use to invest in the services. So I'll stop there. Hope that's been helpful, and perhaps some questions coming on.
It has indeed, Derek, some interesting numbers there. But just before we move on to our next speaker, I just did want to ask, in declaring the housing emergency, did it change much in the way that the problem was tackled or funded?
Yeah, it did. It was really helpful as an officer. It gave me I think the political support I needed to get some key decisions made. So one of the things that we've done here, for example, is due to concurrent issues, we've actually suspended our allocations policy, which means we're effectively direct letting to homeless people now, unless you have what we would call gold priority, which is where there's sufficient urgent need for housing. So some of the big issues that would probably have been more difficult to tackle because we have a housing emergency declared, then I think the politicians are more open to looking at it, because we need to be seen to be doing everything we can. But it's also meant more funding. It's also meant that the working with finance colleagues were able to make more funding available, and the politicians are happy to approve that. So yeah, it's made a big difference, and it's really crystallised all the efforts. It's been helpful to focus everything into one area, and it's a key city priority now, and third sector partners, for example, are embedded in it.
Terrific. Thank you, Derek. We'll come back to you. There are some questions coming through in the Q&A for you as well. So that's coming up in audience Q&A section after we hear from our last two speakers. So let's move on to Fiona Cornelia, who's the Executive Director of Q Shelter, although her connection with the peak body dates back to the 1990s, when she was involved in various committees and working groups striving for housing and homelessness solutions. Fiona is a passionate advocate for the housing and homelessness sector and has held leadership roles in industry peak bodies and in grassroots community development. She has qualifications in social work and social planning and extensive experience across government, community services and private industry. Fiona Cornelia, we'll get you to come off mute, and hello, welcome.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be part of the forum.
Great to have you here. Can you tell us a bit about Q Shelter, firstly, for those who aren't aware of who you are and what you do?
For sure. Queensland Shelter is a peak organisation, and we have a vision that every Queenslander, the state in which we operate, has a home. Our functions are mainly policy advocacy, and we also have a capacity and capability building arm of our organisation. We are focused on Queensland as a state. We're part of a national network of other similar organisations. And the majority of our members are the frontline service providers, both in terms of housing delivery and support services to people who are experiencing homelessness.
So from your experience, what does an effective partnership between councils and community housing providers look like, and higher other levels of government as well in practice?
Look, it's such an important question, and really housing's such a complex set of challenges that the only way really is to achieve the level of collaboration between key stakeholders. And Queensland Shelter probably grew up through its own history, really focused on typologies of housing like social housing, how important that is. And of course it is. But we realise, I think, now that that wider housing system and the health of that housing system in terms of delivering enough housing supply to meet demand as a context in which all of these other responses, more specific and specialised responses, can succeed. So when you think about the whole housing system, the level of partnership required to achieve housing outcomes is really substantial. But I think there are a number of principles that really make me think about local government, because here in Australia, local government is not a major provider of services. We have 3 tiers of government, and a lot of the support services that assist homeless people and a lot of that housing provision is done by the state government and by the not-for-profit sector. So one of the things that I think is really important in terms of that context of partnership is just a deep understanding and appreciation for the scope of the role of local government, because there's genuine concern about them being asked to do more than their funding base will allow. And understanding the boundaries of those roles across all of the different stakeholders at the same time as those roles need to be synergised really effectively. I've seen the best results involving local government and all of the other partners where the mindset is this is us rather than us and them. So I think moving through that threshold of this is what we do and we don't do anything else, it's where everyone moves to the boundary of their role, and there's synergy and innovation and things start to get really interesting.
That is interesting. And I was thinking, as we heard from Derek and Andrew, very different system in play in the UK than here. What do you think of the way the UK local government sector approaches the problem compared to ours? Do you think we can take elements of that would help us more effectively tackle the issue?
Look, I was listening with such great interest and, realising that the environments are so different, yet the challenges are really quite similar. And so many of the issues that Derek raised, I could have, spoken to every single one of those in relation to Queensland and Australia. And I think that what's really important is that local governments have got deep experience in the UK about delivering direct services, which gives them a deep understanding of the needs of the constituency, and also the tensions in the broader community about how you respond, the pressures on public space. And I feel for local governments here because there is now so much visible homelessness in Queensland, tents pitched everywhere, that they are often blamed completely for that, for not just clearing people out. When you look at the UK, having that mix of roles, I think, is really interesting because it brings into the mix of your work not just compliance roles and public space management roles, but a deeper relationship through service provision.
Yeah. And as Catherine said at the outset, it is a global issue. I've just been in Japan and South Korea and was quite surprised to see this time around more obvious homelessness at play. And as we know, councils are often on the front line dealing with those impacts. Just looking at the Australian context, how do you think councils can better position themselves to influence decision making that is made at other levels of government?
It's a fantastic question. I mean, I think some of the answers are about the structures that other speakers have referred to in their own jurisdictions. And I'm thinking of structures like, local government associations and the role that people like Catherine play, very important. In Queensland, there are also subordinate peak bodies like the South East Queensland Council of Mayors. We're working very sort of closely with them, convening all of the mayors in South East Queensland to sit with the Housing Minister and solve things more structurally than just project by project. I think it's really important that there are structures like the Capital Cities group of mayors, and they do go to national government with advocacy positions, and that's just an incredibly important thing to do because we have to take these things in common and present them in such a way that the arguments are compelling, but also it's a clear demonstration of skin in the game and that local governments are wanting to respond, but they can't respond on their own. Not in Australia, the way that the tiers of government are structured.
There have been some recent examples, haven't there, in Queensland as well, of local authorities taking a more punitive approach to the issue. I imagine an organisation like yourself must find that a bit upsetting.
Look, it's deeply upsetting, and I think there's a lot of people in the community that are deeply upset as well. But I've also sat with most of the mayors, and in fact, we co-chair a South East Queensland Council of Mayors, group of mayors with the Housing Minister, and it's just deeply upsetting because they present such deep compassion for the problem and for the people, but they're also under pressure from their wider constituencies where safety issues are emerging, for example. So the only way really to engage with that is to listen with an intention to understand and really try to take the problem. So as a result of that mechanism, there's an agenda of action pieces about collaborative governance to do joint outreach between the community sector, the state government and councils out into parks, for example, meet every single person who doesn't have a home, assess their needs, help them with a pathway into temporary accommodation, but hopefully a long-term pathway into something permanent. In the jurisdictions that are doing that, it's actually really helpful. And in Brisbane City, for example, has got governance around that approach. And Brisbane City also runs an operational group to make that happen on the ground. As we know, we can have all the best intentions, but implementation are where most of the real problems are. So that operational group is really important as well. So I see the struggle and we've got to listen to that. And I also see the alternatives, and those alternatives are really starting to take shape.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is sometimes a reluctance to actually go deeper into the problem, to even acknowledge the problem, I guess, because that's the easy way. How can we break through to some more meaningful discourse on this, particularly at the local government level, do you think? What have you seen perhaps that works well?
Well, actually, I think there are councillors and mayors who are, deeply concerned when members of their communities organise opposition to residential development. So there are real challenges in terms of community opposition, not just to social and affordable housing, but to all types of housing, especially where there's density involved. So, I think when I see things like that, I know that there's so many people in local government, including elected officials, who are really deeply leaning in and really looking for ways to support every aspect of delivery of homes, not just, the traditional ways of delivering. But one of the things that's really important in Australia is for local governments to deliver planning schemes that it can actually achieve housing targets, including all of that typologies of housing that are important to the communities in which they live. In that way, planning schemes are one of the most pivotal ways local governments can make sure there's enough housing supply to meet demand. They don't hold all the levers because the construction industry is on its knees, but without enabling planning schemes, it's really, really hard to sort of layer up the approach that we need to take across the system.
And in fact, Fiona, in some states, less and less of those levers in control of councils. Some state governments are taking away a lot of those levers, as we call them, with the reforms to deal with the housing issue primarily. Is there a role for your sector in advocating for something in that space? Are you concerned that it's moving away from local communities?
Look, I think in a crisis you do centralise things more sometimes if you need to. And we've had a number of mechanisms in Queensland, like state facilitated development and ministerial infrastructure designation, that are intended to fast track planning and development because we're in such a pickle. It's an absolute crisis. So I think it requires just a deep dialogue ongoing about when is it right to centralise some of the levers and when is it right to decentralise them. We know that councils doing things in different ways may reflect the diversity of their communities, but it also can cause confusion and extra cost because some jurisdictions have rates relief for community housing providers, some jurisdictions reduce infrastructure charges, but when other jurisdictions don't, for developers and community housing providers, it can mean that you have to learn each environment and you're responding differently, which just adds cost to the process. So, sometimes that consistency across jurisdictions is just another way, in fact, to facilitate better outcomes.
Perhaps one last question before we move on to Michael, because I'm sure Michael's got something to say on some of those issues that we've just discussed as well. If there was one thing that could be done at the local government level to help your sector grow, because I know you advocate at Q Shelter for growing of the community housing sector, what would you like to see happen?
Look, I think, councils have land and it's really helpful when they're working with community housing providers to enter into land leasing arrangements, for example, or other ways in which property can come across to the community housing sector. That is very helpful. I think definitely leaning in and showing leadership when communities are opposing this typology of housing, absolutely critical as well. And the other thing that local governments can do is bring together strategic leadership groups or governance groups, not just the usual suspects like me and my sector, but across all of the housing system to actually solve place-based problems in place-based ways. I think those three things are all within the reach of councils.
Thank you, Fiona. Very insightful. Stay with us. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, for Q&A. And just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for any of our panellists, please pop those into the Q&A box. There's a few there already, but Catherine will be going through those and selecting as many of those as we can get through before the end of our session tonight. Let's move on to our final speaker, Dr. Michael Fotheringham, who's the Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Michael has held leadership roles at AHURI since 2014. As Managing Director, he's responsible for setting the National Housing Research Agenda and curating an internationally lauded policy research evidence base on housing, homelessness and urban issues. He provides expert advice to Commonwealth and state ministers and has sought for evidence-informed advice by senior policymakers in Australia and internationally. Michael, welcome to our discussion.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Great to have you here. You have the benefit of being the last to go and having heard our three speakers. What's jumped out at you from what you've heard from our speakers so far tonight?
I think the fact that they have made this very easy for me by saying most of the things that I wanted to say.
Is that right?
I think we're all on a bit of a unity ticket with a lot of this. There's a lot to do in this space, and listening particularly to Fiona with an Australian perspective. A lot of my comments that she was making, a lot of the comments she was making are things that I've said in other forums. So strongly agree with pretty much everything she said. I guess the one point I wanted to add, just in relation to Fiona's comments, though, was the real diversity of scale of local governments in Australia, you know, from Brisbane City Council with something like 1.3 million residents down to, I think the smallest is 1,500 residents in one of the small shires in Western Australia. So there's a real diversity of scale across the 537 councils, and therefore the capacity to act in relation to these challenges is highly varied.
But fair to say, Michael, that they're all grappling with this issue, aren't they?
I think this is the positive for those of us who've been interested in housing and homelessness for a long time. What we're seeing across the country is virtually every government at each level, federal, state, territory, and local government, are really concerned about housing, are really looking to address the challenge. You know, we had decades of policy neglect in this space. That time is over. It's going to take some time to build our way out of the supply side of the issue. The service side needs equal support, so there's a lot to do, but at least people are paying attention.
Yeah. So it's been said that, you know, while people are willing to talk about homelessness in particular, taking action on it is a different matter. How do we shift the dialogue, I guess? We're in an environment at the moment politically where it's actually hard to for people to cut through the extremist sort of views, isn't it? And the social issues are getting a little bit left behind. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, you know, housing we can talk about as a social issue. We can talk about it as an economic issue, as an infrastructure discussion. There's the range of lenses you can bring to this, and they all have value. So I think we need to be open to that really complex conversation. But I think, you know, there's a need to try and find the right way to do this. There's no one solution to this. We need to be open to lots of different approaches, but it is a really complex problem.
So our system in Australia places the responsibility for homelessness at different levels of government when compared to the UK, as we've heard tonight. How do you see that shaping the role of councils and what they should or could be doing in this space?
I mean, you're right to say at different levels, not at a different level, because housing policy, homelessness policy are not the responsibility of one particular tier of government. These are shared responsibilities, and, you know, shared responsibilities can be unclear, can be blurred, can be no one's responsibility if there's not a clear sense of who should be doing what. So one of the real challenges in this country, I think, is that coordination of the roles of different tiers of government. So, you know, what are the feds doing? Is that going to be stable over time? What are the states and territories doing? Is that a framework that local governments can work with consistently over time? You know, and then how can councils work with that? So, you know, the instability over time, particularly as governments change, you know, for partisan reasons, you know, conservative to progressive parties, and therefore the strategies shift, that has ramifications for the other tiers of government and their ability to coordinate with it. So having long-term stable policy settings that we can have an agreed vision of where we're going with our housing policy is a really important thing to get to.
If you could build the perfect policy to tackle this problem, where would you draw from? What do you see that does, in your view, work well?
It would change the world, wouldn't we? Because, you know, one of the interesting things that we've been talking about lately is, you know, in Australia you often hear that we have a housing crisis in this state, and then if you travel to the next state, you'll find they're having the same conversation. This state has its a unique housing crisis. So I've talked to radio presenters in 3 or 4 different states that have said, why is our state getting it wrong and everyone else can work this out? The reality is
not
no
the
one else is
case.
working this out. And as you look around the UK, you look around Europe, you look around North America, similar conversations are happening across the globe. We have actually a global pattern of crises that we're treating as local crises.
Yeah.
They're actually, there's a much bigger pattern here to understand.
Is there anywhere that doesn't have the issue?
Look, yes, but not places that have free and open democracies and the sorts of systems of government we have. So, you know, if you take an authoritarian regime, you can address some of these things because no one owns anything. It's not necessarily a solution that we're looking for. So, yeah, there might be another way to do this.
Yeah.
Having said all that, as much as this is a global challenge, the solutions tend to be local because, you know, these are the local governments that are best connected to the frontline services, to the lived experience of people who are vulnerable.
Yeah.
So as much as we need those higher tiers of government to create stable and sensible policy settings, we need local governments as a presence in this process.
Are there silos, though? Do we need to break down some of the structures that exist before we can actually really meaningfully get everyone on the same page here?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, one of the things that's been shifting, particularly in state governments and most recently in the Australian federal government, is thinking about the structure of our government entities, of our government departments. So recently, the Australian government has consolidated all of its housing policy into one department. What used to be part of our Department of Social Services, a Department of Infrastructure, a Department of Industry and Science, as well as in Treasury, are now all consolidated into one department as a major branch of the Treasury. So it's a central agency with the powers that come with being a central agency. But all of the people working on housing in its different forms, whether it's around construction or the building code, or welfare services attached to housing supply or homelessness support, or all the relevant programs funding the states to do their work, are in one branch of Treasury. So that's changed the way the Commonwealth is thinking. It's also attached to the Minister for Housing, and we do have a Minister for Housing at this time. There was a period in the last 10 or 15 years where we've had no minister responsible for housing. But we do have a Minister for Housing who's also a Minister for Cities. And I think that really is important in integrating our thinking around housing, planning, infrastructure under one leadership.
Yeah.
Same sort of things happened at state level a number of times over recent years.
You advise on policy. What would you like to see happen, or is there anything happening in the policy space that's giving you hope or confidence at the moment?
Well, I think one of the things that gives me some encouragement is that we're seeing a more complex approach to addressing housing challenges, rather than thinking if we do this one thing, we'll fix it. That sort of magical thinking, the sort of silver bullet or wave a magic wand thinking, is fading, and we're starting to understand that this is a sophisticated problem that needs a sophisticated set of solutions.
Yeah.
It needs partnerships. The National Housing Accord gets talked about a lot in Australia for its target of 1.2 million homes over 5 years. But a lot of that commentary misses out on the nuance of the National Housing Accord, which is 1.2 million well-located homes over the next 5 years. And thinking about what well-located means involves other disciplines, not just housing construction, but it's about the planning, it's about the infrastructure supply, it's about thinking about how the different agencies can work together, and it's about where people actually want to live in and to engage in economic activity, in education, in employment, and so on.
Yeah. Perhaps one last question, Michael, before we move to open Q&A, and there's a few messages coming in for the box. We hear every day how councils are resource limited in some states, rate capped environments, etc. What do you advise councils to do in terms of where they can put their resources for the best bang for buck in this space, given that in most states councils aren't actually delivering the housing as such, but they are on the front line of homelessness?
Yeah, seeing some of the figures, from the first two presenters was pretty eye-opening. The sort of budgets and resources available are quite different to what councils in Australia tend to experience. And we've all heard the sort of dismissive comments about rates and rubbish. And who recently put out a report talking about resilience and the need, particularly after disasters, for local government to play a lead role, because they're the ones who have the best understanding of that local area and local community. I think partnerships is a key part of this. Fiona talked about this already, but to echo her comments, that partnership with philanthropy, with community sector is really vital. Partnership with state and territory governments is really important too. So while they may not have the resources to do it all themselves, local governments do play a key role in having locally relevant responses.
Thank you, Michael. We'll leave it there and move on to Q&A and see if we can get a lot of these questions through to our panel. Catherine joins us now to manage this part of the session. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that. And hopefully my internet will keep going. I seem to be having some trouble, but clearly we've heard from everyone who's spoken tonight that getting the governance model right, that's the key, or at least not the key to solving all of the issues, but it's the start of that. And I guess I'd just throw it open to the panel. Why is it so hard? I mean, we've talked about the fact that different levels of government have responsibilities in different areas for housing and homelessness. Then we have the role of local government in their local planning schemes, but then we have interventions coming in from central and state government. And then, of course, we have federal government. Just really interested in why are we making it so hard and how can we do this better?
I think you've stumped them with your first question, Catherine. Anyone like to have a go at that, Michael?
Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, I sort of spoke to this a little bit before, so I guess just to extend on my earlier comments. Look, it is a complex problem. It involves a range of sectors. There are some conflicting interests in this. So, you know, for commercial sectors, there are challenges there to maintain sustainable commercial businesses and get good outcomes. So, you know, that partnership with different sectors is not straightforward and simple. I do think having an agreed plan, having an understood role for each of the different sectors as well as tiers of government in this is really important. And we see some examples in other policy arenas where there's a clear national strategy, maybe even a global strategy, thinking of sort of some of the UN strategies around sustainable development goals and so forth. And then, you know, if the national entity has a clear plan, the states below them and the councils below that can work with those frameworks and implement dovetailed plans for that. Now, that sort of coherence is hard to achieve in housing where there are so many different types of interest. There's both, you know, there's land lens to this as well as the housing lens to this. It's complex, but it can be done.
Yeah, look, and I do pick up your point about, particularly at the emergency management level, we have national strategies on that. I mean, has it got to a point where we do need to really look at that as a serious option?
Yes.
Yeah. Derek, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to come in on this. I think it's an interesting question. I think there's some tensions. I mean, as a local authority here, we have competing legal obligations. So we're a planning authority, we're a statutory housing authority, we're a regulatory authority. So we have a responsibility to take action against certain types of, in this context, certain types of property. We had an issue last year, for example, where some of the property we were using was turned out to be unlicensed. So we are looking to comply with Housing Scotland Act 1987 in terms of giving people somewhere to stay, but we were doing it by using unlicensed property, which meant we had to stop doing it. So there are tensions there in terms of probably unintended consequences in some regards. But I think I set out some of the ways that we are trying to and have been tackling this in Scotland through Homelessness Task Force example given, or the Strategic Housing Group. But what we've got at a Scottish level now for the first time is a Cabinet Secretary for Housing. So we previously had a Housing Minister. And here the Cabinet Secretaries report directly to the First Minister. So that has elevated the status of housing across Scotland. And that has brought some much welcomed impetus into, there's been, into the sector, for example, some discussions about planning relaxations, so increase in funding being proposed as well. So I think there is something at that national and local working together. It's pretty obvious it needs to, but I think we're seeing in Scotland here with the housing emergencies that those two regimes start to work in partnership in order to tackle what is a national issue.
Yeah, look, thank you, Derek. I did have a question for you also. I noted in one of the charts you put up that you said the housing approval numbers were dropping. And I was just curious as to why that was.
Yeah, it's probably a few reasons, as you'd expect. One of them has been the housing bill. So we've got a housing bill that's currently going through Parliament. It's actually, I think, stage 3 debate was yesterday. It introduced a proposal on rent capping properties, and some developers who were developing for the private rented market, build to rent, for example, and mid-market rent, because of the uncertainty that rent cap caused, they just stopped. They just said, well, we can't start building again. We can't start planning until we understand what that rent cap's going to mean, because obviously they're operating on a different financial model. Excuse me. So that put a bit of a block on some. We have recently introduced a policy on let me get this right, all planning applications where there are 20 houses or over, so 20 accommodation, flat houses, mixed, whatever, 35% of those are to be for affordable housing. So it used to be 25 and now 35%, which from an affordable housing point of view, a social point of view, is good. But I think what that's meant is some of the developers are looking at their plans again and saying, okay, now we need to provide more. And we have technical things, as I'm sure everyone else does. And in Scotland, it's a Section 75 application, which is when you build so many houses, you have to provide schooling or provide funding for schooling and doctor surgeries, etc. in the area. So I think some of these decisions at a national level and a local level are just making the market pause a bit and reflect on what that's going to mean for them, what it's going to mean for their plans, and developers are businesses, so what it means for their bottom line.
And just another question for you, Derek. I was really interested in your comment, and you mentioned it just then, also around the compliance issues.
Mm-hmm.
So who's responsible? Forgive me if I've misinterpreted this. So there is potentially accommodation available, but it doesn't meet compliance standards. Is that correct? And
Yeah.
who's responsible for maintaining, or I guess enforcing, compliance standards?
Yeah, so the specific issue I referred to were so that in houses in multiple occupations, so where there are 3 or more people in a house and they're not related, then you have to have a licence. It's to do with fire safety standards, electrical checks, etc. So the properties are safe. And if you're not licensed to operate, then you shouldn't be operating, so it would be illegal. And we were using some of those for a period of time post the pandemic, and we were just finding it difficult to get out of that position. So that's a compliance issue. Enforcement for that is the council's regulatory services, because that's how the legislation works. So that's an issue. Separately would be the condition of properties in the city. So we have a private sector enforcement team. So if you're a landlord and you're renting out property and it's not fit for habitation, then you can complain to us, and we go and investigate the quality of the property, and taking action as we saw fit. I think what we find though is that many people who are in substandard property won't complain because they're worried about where they're going to live next if they don't do it. That's a completely separate issue. The housing multiple occupation issue that I mentioned there meant that we've ended up with around 500 less accommodation types in the city than we had this time last year, which is obviously putting a further pressure on where we're able to house people and how many we're able to house.
Andrew, I can see you nodding your head. Is that a similar issue in Liverpool?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have. I mean, if I could just go back around to the original question, I think one of our challenges is it's conflicting priorities within the local authority. So I think I talked a little bit about the third most deprived city third most deprived local authority, actually, not city. And I think we want to create a more balanced housing market. We want to have a housing market that can retain higher income households, so that they spend their money in the city, and that does sometimes create some tensions between, particularly in parts of the city where colleagues and developers want to don't want to provide any affordable housing, and it is a bit of a challenge really, when we've got 1,700 households in temporary accommodation, and we need really to provide more social rented products, which is the most affordable rental product in the country. And sometimes there is a bit of a tension there. So I think one of the challenges local authorities have, not just in this area, but a whole range of areas, is that we have a number of conflicting priorities. And I think as officers, we have quite robust conversations to try and resolve that. Within my service area, I also manage the private sector housing team. So yes, we have compliance officers, we have enforcement officers, and one of the things that we are trying to do is work better together, so that we're not necessarily we will prohibit property, but we're trying to be a little bit more working together, proactive with people, and finding people alternative accommodation before we are prohibiting properties. And we're only really prohibiting the worst cases, but I think that's an advantage of having it all in one area where, you know, we work together, people sit on the same floor, we have those conversations. So that's probably what I was nodding about. But it's clearly there is those tensions, I think, between wanting to create a more mixed housing economy, which we do need in Liverpool. I wouldn't disagree with that. But also dealing with some of the immediate issues. I didn't say in the presentation, but we own no homes whatsoever. So another challenge for us is everything we have to do it through our registered provider partners. So it's persuading our registered provider partners to deliver the type of products that that are the most affordable. So the social rental products. And again, what we've had in Liverpool over a number of years is a product that is considered an affordable housing product called Rent to Buy, but it's not that affordable. Would be my view. It's not allocated through the council's housing allocations policy. So again, some tensions there, but working with our partners, and again, probably going a bit of legacy here. Like, we haven't had that sort of close dialogue, that relationship with our providers. It's been lost over a number of years. But that's another challenge for us. We don't have housing stock, so we don't own any housing stock. It's all being transferred to registered provider partners, and it's really critical that we work quite closely with them, and they're clear what our priorities are, and viability as well. As Derek was talking about, having delivered direct delivery when I was in Salford, construction costs have gone through the roof, particularly since the pandemic as well, and that has big impact in terms of viability and how we can increase that supply of affordable housing. Yeah,
look, it goes back to that governance issue and not working in silos or breaking them down. Yeah. Fiona, you've got your hand up.
We in Queensland, the recently formed government has put together a productivity commission, which is examining in the first instance costs and time costs of construction, and you know, that's largely beneficial. It's been interesting though; it's put under the spotlight some areas of quality. Some quality measures like accessibility standards, for example. It's examining a range of matters to do with the speed and cost of delivering homes. And I think we're in a place where it's really important to remain discerning. As much of a crisis as it is, it's important that we don't set aside all of the quality measures and the standards that are delivering more diverse homes, especially to vulnerable cohorts. The other thing I just want to say is that we as Q Shelter are leaning into the subset of the construction industry that's focused on modern methods of construction. Like, we know that there are some fledgling efforts by the Queensland State Government to bring more homes into the market using modern methods of construction, but we think this is a massive area of reform for us, that we need to adopt some of the things we did during post-war nation building and just build as many homes as we can, high quality homes, but really reform construction methods so that we are building a construction industry for the future. And we've got a pipeline of homes that can be either, you know, single dwellings, medium density or higher density homes. That needs deep reform in Queensland.
Thanks, Fiona. Now, I will get to those questions in the chat and the Q&A. Councillor Tom Crook, you've had a question here about what role do you think inclusionary zoning can play, and what would you recommend regional councils in Victoria use this, or sorry, would you recommend regional councils in Victoria use this as part of their toolkit to improve affordable housing outcomes? Perhaps that's one for Michael or any of the panellists.
Happy to have a crack at that. Look, I think broadly inclusionary zoning can be very helpful, but there are some caveats there. I think one of the challenges in introducing inclusionary zoning regulations in Australia has been around the industry's pipeline of development. So if a feasibility study's been done on a particular plot of land and a developer has purchased that land with some assumptions, changing those assumptions before that property is developed puts that project in jeopardy. And so we hear a lot of pushback from industry saying that that's going to make those projects unfeasible. So there needs to be a grandfathering or a gradual introduction so that the developers have time to complete current projects and know what's coming in terms of zoning changes. That's the first caveat. The second one is for a regional council to introduce that is challenging because it encourages developers to build elsewhere. They can build in a neighbouring region instead where they don't have those, what from an industry perspective, costs attached to development, or less return attached to development. So if we're going to introduce inclusionary zoning in a serious way in Australia, which I believe we should, it needs to be done at least at a state level, preferably, frankly, nationally.
Thanks, Michael, for that. A few more from the chat. I've got one here from Wendy Guide. Could you elaborate a bit more on what the prevention work involves and what information you have on how people have ended up in the place they find themselves in? I think, is that one for Fiona, perhaps? I'm not sure.
I think it was either Andrew or Derek. It came in early.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
Derek.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to make a start on that. I just lowered my hand. Yeah, so prevention is a challenging thing to try and achieve. What we're doing here is looking at preventative budgeting. So looking at where we can prevent, where we intervene early, and where we're having to mitigate. Obviously, prevention is the cheaper of those options, and mitigation is the high end of probably detailed support, pretty intensive support. We know in Edinburgh around 60 to 65% of our presentations as homelessness are due to relationship breakdown. So when someone comes forward, we'll ask them, we have to do a statutory homeless assessment, and they're telling us why. Most of the time they don't always, but they'll tell us why they're homeless. And so we know that relationship breakdown, that can be violent or non-violent. It could be children, children being asked to leave the house, children feeling they have to leave the house for their own safety. And just by talking about those 3 or 4 issues there, you'll understand that in order to tackle that issue, we have to work with potentially social work, police, education services, for example. So it's about understanding as early as we can what the issues are, and then how we stop them escalating. Sometimes that's multi-agency, sometimes it's just a referral to one part of the council, one agency, and sometimes ourselves in order to do that. Within the rest of that, we'll find there's quite a lot of money issues, so affordability. Sometimes it's simply an eviction issue of how someone being told that the landlord's selling the house and they're going to have to leave. So there's a lot. It's a really difficult thing. There's a whole other webinar and session on just preventative work, I'm sure. But ultimately, it's about, our experience would be, it's definitely about joint working. It's definitely across the public sector, understanding as much as we can the social issues that people are facing. We know where in the city people are likely to be in poverty. We know how to probably target some areas of the city for some more support, but that doesn't mean that from other parts of the city, and we think an issue like domestic abuse, for example, it's no respecter of income or nationality or anything. If it's there, it's there, and we have to deal with it and support people in the right way. So that's maybe a start. I don't know if Andrew wants to come in, but that would be a quick dip in the toe of what we do about prevention.
Yeah, I can come in there if that help. So I think that, as I said in my presentation, this is an area where we as a service have really got to improve. So it costs about £30,000 to house a household in temporary accommodation for a year. So when we do some modelling and you see the impacts of prevention, it soon adds up in terms of cost avoidance, cost savings. So this is, as I said in my presentation, this is why we're putting a lot of resource and increasing the numbers in our teams around prevention and assessment to prevent that. So yeah, as Derek said, it's about that early intervention. It's about potential mediation if a child's being asked to leave at home. Could you, working with family, get them to stay longer? Is the landlord, having served a Section 21, which is a notice of seeking possession or eviction, could they rescind that? are there rent arrears? Could you pay off those rent arrears, and would that enable that tenancy continue? So I suppose it's a whole range of issues. And I think the critical thing is, though, it's getting in early. It's getting in when I think there are opportunities for solutions, which is again why we're investing in the service, because what happens here in Liverpool is that we have previously haven't really had the resource to respond to that, haven't responded to that, and then it's too late, and and they're being kicked out and then presenting to the local authority, and the relationship has totally broken down. And it's those sort of activities that we hope can help to prevent people from going into temporary accommodation, where we have a duty to put them into temporary accommodation.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think we did have a question also about strategies to reduce temporary accommodation costs in the Q&A. But Derek, is that a new hand or an old hand?
It is a new hand. Just wanted to come back in, if that's okay, just briefly on that same issue. So I mentioned earlier on there's a housing bill working through the Scottish Parliament, and the stage 3 debate has been happening this week. That legislation is likely to will introduce an asking attitude. So some of the points that Andrew and I have mentioned there will effectively be enshrined in law, and that will require public sector bodies, a set list of public sector bodies, ourselves, health service, police, social landlords, etc., where we think someone is threatened with or is actually homeless. We have a legal obligation to share that information in order to prevent it escalating to actual homelessness where it's threatened with. So I don't know what that bill looks like at the final stage, but that's a move by the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, very strongly supported to ensure, not leave it to chance, but ensure that information is shared to prevent homelessness. The current legislation requires certain authorities to do that within 56 days, and this new legislation, it will extend that out to 6 months prior to any possible homelessness. So a big legislative change here again in Scotland, which we're looking forward to.
Thanks for that, Derek. Look, and I'm sorry, we probably haven't got time to get to all the questions there, but Simon Shuttleworth has a good one, I think, to end on. I'm very conscious of the time. And he's asking that all panelists thinking about local approaches to homelessness. If you could recommend one change that would make a difference at a strategic level and one change that would make a difference at an operational level, what would they be? And I'll open that up. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy
Fiona,
to go first. Sorry, I was
yeah.
just looking for my hand to put it up. Look, I do think that the previous discussion about prevention is really important in answering this question, because I think the most strategic thing in terms of intergovernmental coordination and partnership with the community and the community services sector is to really design the entire human services system and framework, inclusive of universal services like education and health, to identify people at the most early stages of their life where they are demonstrating the vulnerabilities that we know lead to longer term complex homelessness in adults. So I think strategically the most important thing to do is to design a wider systems approach to prevention, and then have an accountability and an implementation guarantee that we're finding children when they're at risk, even as early as they're born. What we're seeing here in Queensland is that the level of complex homelessness among adults is really, really difficult to solve. So a prevention framework embedded strategically, and then operationally, I think jurisdictional groups, leadership groups that really drive the implementation of successful strategies at the local level, where we've got primary, secondary, tertiary prevention defined, and we've got elements in the system that aiming to achieve all of those things. Thanks,
Fiona. Michael.
I get asked if you could do just one thing, what's the one thing you would do? Question most panels I speak on, and I've become a little blunt in my response to it. If we're looking for a single magical solution, we're kidding ourselves. There's no one thing we can do at either a strategic or an operational level that's going to really address the challenges we're trying to take on. It is a complex set of problems and it needs a complex set of solutions. The closest I can come to a one thing we'd do is have a genuine strategy that involves partnership between each of the sectors that are involved in this, between local government, state government, federal government, industry and community sectors. But it needs to be a complex plan that addresses a complex solution over an extended period of time.
Thanks, Michael. Andrew?
I think for me, the crux of a lot of the issue is supply. And I think one of the things we really got to look at is increasing supply of new build. But I also think it's about utilising existing stock and utilising that more effectively. So, empty properties is, again, it's an issue in Liverpool. It may not be an issue in Edinburgh, but it's definitely an issue in Liverpool. And how we can some powers that we can have to get those properties back into use, I think would be really beneficial. We have some, but again, it's a very long process. So for me, supply, is critical. And I think operationally, it's for me, it's about making sure that we embed our preventative model, our preventative framework, and that's the thing that we need to focus on in Liverpool as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And Derek, lucky last.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously there isn't one answer here. Strategic is going to be funding new houses. If I had 6,000 houses tomorrow that were available to me, I wouldn't have a homelessness problem. Operational would then be designing the systems to sustain tenancies, whatever that looks like. Probably redesign of some public sector delivery. But yeah, I think supply right now is the one issue. If we get people into houses, we can work at keeping them there, but that's a big ask.
Thank you. And can I just thank all the panelists for your contributions during the discussions today. They've been, really very informative, very timely, and you can see from the questions that were coming through, there's a lot of interest and we can talk about this for many more hours, but we are at time now. So I will hand back to Chris to wrap up, and thank you once again for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. As you said, another great discussion. So thank you to Andrew from Liverpool, Derek from Edinburgh, Fiona from Kew Shelter, and Michael from Ahuri for your contributions. Thank you to all of our audience members who've participated this evening or this morning, and for your questions. And as always, apologies that we couldn't get to all of those. That concludes our Global Executive Panel, and that concludes the season for 2025. So on behalf of VLGA and LGIU, thank you all for being part of the series this year. Hopefully, we'll be back with more next year, and there'll be announcements about that in due course. As we mentioned at the outset,